Hello, this is Zach from Theology Gaming, and I'm here with more Hearthstone. Yes, I know Hearthstone's not interesting to many people, but it is to me, so I'm going to talk about it. Anyway, I wanted to do something a little different this time around. I usually kind of have a weird deck where I play it and things happen, but I would rather talk about why certain decks work instead, or at least my estimation of why they work. Pro players are good at explaining why a card's good or bad, I guess, but sometimes they are quite wrong in their predictions of what works. For example, Grim Patron was assumed to be a pretty bad card, and it ended up being one of those metagame-defining decks that is now all over the ladder. Everyone thought BRM was going to be like, big dragons everywhere, and then big dragons ended up not being so good. So I think I might be able to explain why certain things work, and the first thing I wanted to do was look at Control Warrior. So Control Warrior is a pretty standard deck. It's kind of existed since the game has started, and it has mostly been supplemented by the addition of expansion cards. Now, why is it called Control? Well, Control Warrior is trying to control the board. It's trying to control your opponent and make sure that he can't actually place anything on the board, because the more things he has on the board, the more likely you are to lose, and everything in Control Warrior is centered around that particular objective. Obviously, these are pretty obvious things to anything or anyone who's playing Hearthstone or has played any kind of card game like this, but, anyway, there's some background for you. So, the reason why Warrior is the specific deck in which Control Warrior came to pass is mostly because it has a whole lot of removal tools that don't use a lot of resources and also are supplemented by the Warrior's primary ability. So, for those who don't know, the primary hero power of Warrior is for 2 mana you can add 2 armor. Armor is not health, but you can keep adding on armor to yourself. So a lot of the cards in this deck are there to supplement that particular goal. So Armor Smith is one of the main reasons why Control Warrior can work, which is basically whenever a friendly minion takes damage, gain 1 armor. So you use this basically to armor yourself up even when you don't have enough mana or you don't choose to use mana to armor yourself up. And this basically works with any kind of self-damage inflicting spell, like Whirlwind, for example. Whirlwind does 1 damage to all minions, not just your opponents. So in terms of getting, let's say, 5 or 6 minions on the board, and then you do a Whirlwind, well, there you go. It's not about how much damage they take, but it's just about something that is taking damage. And I guess that's part of why Grim Patron works, for example. And a lot of Warrior cards are centered around the theme of take damage, get something, or deal damage to something, give it a buff. Like Cruel Taskmaster, which kind of works with everything. So Cruel Taskmaster deals 1 damage to a minion, gives it +2 attack, which is good for charge minions. It's good for if you need to make a trade, but it's also good for removal of an enemy that has 1 health left. So that actually works really well for a number of different purposes and not just its primary. That's why this deck works, because a lot of this stuff has multiple angles of attack and multiple uses. So you never really have a dead hand. You just have to figure out how to efficiently use your cards, because all this early game stuff is meant to supplement this late game craziness. So, and one of the primary reasons why it works is because of Fiery War Axe, which is in the basic set of all things, but it's definitely one of the best cards in the entire deck and probably one of the best cards in the game because it's incredibly cheap removal. It's 3 attack, you get to use it twice, assuming they don't destroy your weapon through some other means. And in the early game, if you have this in your hand, you are basically guaranteed to at least get rid of 1 or 2 things, or damage them significantly enough to use another card to get rid of them. So let's say like something has 4 health, you can hit it with the axe, and then you smack it with Whirlwind, and there you go. There's your removal. Same with Cruel Taskmaster, moves back and forth. Now, in terms of getting more of that removal in place, Shield Slam is excessively useful for this purpose. Because, as I've said previously, you're trying to build up armor the entire game so that you can survive the early rounds to get to late game. Shield Slam is great for this because you're always going to be getting armor, assuming ideal circumstances. And Shield Slam's power can get pretty high up there, to the point where it can pretty much eliminate any minion in the game for 1 mana, which is, as you might expect, kind of crazy. But again, you have to actually get there. So there's other means to get armor too, like Shield Block. Shield Block is pretty standard. Get 5 armor, draw a card. Control Warrior doesn't have the best card draw in the world, and the reason why it doesn't have the best card draw is because Warrior in general doesn't. For the purposes of this deck, most people would use, like, you would have Slam, right? Slam gives you a card if a minion survives, which is, like, not super useful in this deck. And there's also one other one that gives you card draw. What am I missing? Well, as you can tell, this is somewhat unscripted, so get used to these things. Anyway, Warrior doesn't have a ton of card draw, so that's part of the problem with the deck. But the way that you get around it, again, is with self-damage and Acolyte of Pain. Acolyte of Pain is used in a lot of decks where you can get a lot more card draw than you normally would, so the ideal way to play Acolyte of Pain is not so much play it right on the board, because obviously, like, what if you're playing against a warrior? He's going to use Fiery War Axe on you. Or if you're playing a druid, they're going to use Wrath on it. They don't want you to get card draw. Even a priest might use Shadow Word Pain on this to immediately get rid of it. So around the 4 or 5 mana mark, you want to play this, and then you want to play something that does damage to it at the same time to ensure that you get the card draw the first time. Because what can happen in Control Warrior, at least in my experience, is that you end up with not enough cards. If you play Acolyte of Pain, you need to use your card draw wisely and not just spread your resources too thin. And I think another way that Naxxramas really helped Control Warrior was to add Death Spite, which is, it's more expensive than Fiery War Axe, but the Death Rattle, which is basically, if you use it twice, you get 4 damage per swing, which is great, right? But then you get a Death Rattle, which is when the weapon expires, it deals 1 damage to every single minion on the board. So, in terms of, let's say, I have an Acolyte of Pain on the board. I get free card draw. I have a bunch of other minions on the board and Armorsmith. Great, I got a ton of armor. See, there's synergy here. And these are interesting cards. So, obviously, these are like tools to get them to the mid-game. So, and then you have Shield Maiden, obviously. That's a great card just in and of itself. So you get a 5/5 minion on the board, and you get 5 armor at the same time, which is pretty brilliant, I'd say. Now, everything else in this is basically a means by which to control the board for as long as possible. So, Execute is the pretty standard one. Since you have a lot of things that damage the whole board, even for a little, Execute works great. So, like, an enemy has, like, a big minion, you kind of tag it with a Cruel Taskmaster or a Whirlwind, or you just smack it with the axe, which is not ideal when the minions get up there in attack power, or the Death Spite, and then you use Execute, and boom, there you go. You've killed something almost automatically, which is great, because, again, 1 mana. You're trying to use as little resources as possible to clear the board as much as possible. Because Control Warrior is not really about slapping minions down the entire time. The minions are basically a means to an end, and I think you'll get what I mean later. So, here's some other things that Control Warrior does to control the board. Big Game Hunter is kind of the standard, obvious one. From what I can tell, the reason why Big Game Hunter exists is not to kill all the fun in the game, although I kind of feel that way sometimes. Because if you play anything with 7 or more health, it basically dies to Big Game Hunter, and you're left with nothing. And they get a 4/2 minion, and they only spend 3 mana on it. I think the reason why Big Game Hunter exists is to get rid of the Giants, because the Giants have strange cost reduction mechanics, and they didn't want them to be too powerful. But on the other hand, the problem of everyone running Big Game Hunter because of Dr. Boom, because Dr. Boom is super overpowered in any event, you basically have this Big Game Hunter guy. But anyway, because he exists, there's no reason not to use Big Game Hunter, and he can be used to control one of your opponent's biggest threats at some point or another. Now, as far as Sludge Belcher goes, he is meant to control the mid-game. So Sludge Belcher is super annoying. Sludge Belcher sits there as a 3/5 taunt, which is pretty reasonable for 5 mana, and then when it dies, it summons a 1/2 minion with taunt. Now, weirdly enough, the health total of Sludge Belcher does not often matter, because what you're trying to do is get your opponent to waste cards. It's a stall card. It's used in a ton of control decks because it stalls so well. So even if your opponent has like 2 or 3 minions and that's all they have to be able to deal with Sludge Belcher, they have to use and waste 2 attacks on the Sludge Belcher rather than actually use it on your face, which is exactly what you want them to do. So as far as that goes, we've gotten all the kind of utility cards, and now everything else is just like dump legendaries on the board. But the dumped legendaries also have practical uses. So Emperor Thaurissan is the newer addition to Control Warrior for the obvious reason that cost reduction mechanics in card games are super powerful, and there's no reason not to use Emperor Thaurissan. At the end of your turn, reduce the cost of cards in your hand by 1. Now, obviously, you want to have as many cards in your hand as possible when playing Thaurissan, but this isn't always ideal, so you want to put him down. In a way, he also acts, at least from what I can tell, as a sort of soft taunt, because anytime somebody drops Thaurissan, you do not want them to get the effect twice in a row. So you do get the effect immediately upon throwing Thaurissan down, but your opponent doesn't want you to get it a second time, because if it lingers on the board too long, there's a lot of craziness that can happen. So he works on a number of different levels, which is great. Lotheb, I'm kind of ambiguous about Lotheb because I think he's more of a metagame dependent card. The other one I would think that would actually fit in this slot would be Harrison Jones, depending on what kind of opponents you're facing. So if you're facing a lot of weapon heavy classes, you want to use Harrison Jones, because let's say you face a Shaman and they throw out a Doomhammer. A Doomhammer has 8 durability, so more than likely they're going to attack twice when they play the Doomhammer, and then basically you get to play this, and you get 6 cards, which is pretty crazy. And that's enough to win you the game, because you just have so many options to deal with everything your opponent can do. But Lotheb's pretty good too for spell-heavy classes, any class that intends to use buffs or anything. I mean, it's kind of reduced in usefulness since Lotheb has been used so much, but he's still very, very good. I mean, it's still a 5/5 for 5, and then you get this crazy effect where an opponent can't use spells they have to use a spell at a heavy cost, which is what more tends to be happening, especially if they have a board. But if their damage is relying on spells, I mean, they're pretty much screwed. Sylvanas is a strange card that has somehow become one of the best cards in the whole game. Originally, it was a 5 for 5/5, and it did the exact same effect, which is take control of a random enemy minion. But the reason why it's good is almost similar to the same way Thaurissan is good, is that it gives you a positive effect, but the positive effect is reliant upon your opponent's actions. So let's say you slap this down, they have 2 giant minions, right? They see Sylvanas, they go, oh crap, Sylvanas is going to steal one of these 2 minions. More than likely, they're going to either try to kill Sylvanas some way or trade it into Sylvanas in such a way that you don't get anything. But what it does in that way is that it forces the opponent to react in a way they don't want to. So playing it on an empty board is not great. But playing it on a board with a bunch of minions behind a taunt is much better. But most of the time, you can just basically play Sylvanas anytime there's some high-value minion on the other side of the board, and your opponent is not going to like it. Because, again, you can kind of throw Sylvanas into anyone, and you can also get an execute on Sylvanas or shield slam on Sylvanas. All these self-damage mechanics actually help you get something from Sylvanas, even if your opponent doesn't want to. Again, Sylvanas is in a ton of decks. I mean, it's one of the 3 best legendaries in the game, I would say, along with Dr. Boom and probably Ragnaros the Fire Lord. Ragnaros is just really good in general. I mean, this is like neutral minions. This isn't class specific, because you can't say a class-specific one is technically the best in the game because all the classes are pretty well-balanced for the most part, maybe except Shaman. But as far as neutral legendaries go, Sylvanas is pretty amazing. Again, all these legendaries are kind of interchangeable if you really want to change around stuff, but I kind of like the options that are in this particular version. Like Baron Geddon, for example. I don't think Baron Geddon's really played in any other deck archetype or style. Maybe I saw a Control Hunter that used Baron Geddon, but you're rarely going to see it outside of a Control Warrior context. And the reason why is that against an aggro deck, it's basically like a 7-mana board clear. A much better board clear than Deathwing, for obvious reasons. But Baron Geddon's very, very good at, you slap it down, a bunch of 2-health minions die, and you might take 2 damage yourself, but assuming you had a bunch of armor in the first place, it's really not going to affect you. And the low health total, not going to affect you either. And especially because it's a 7/5, it's not great, but it's enough that you can drop it, and it's enough of a threat that an opponent will want to get rid of it. Now we're here at Dr. Boom, who for the current moment is probably the best legendary in the game. And the reason why is because no matter in what situation you're in, a 7/7 for 7 seems okay, but the 1/1 boom bots usually explode on things and have random effects that could potentially swing the game. It really depends, and even though it's very random, most of the time the randomness fits to your advantage, because an opponent does not want to deal with these boom bots, and it does not want to deal with Dr. Boom, hence the inclusion of Big Game Hunter in just about every deck on the planet. So, Dr. Boom is a great control card. As you can see, there's a theme here. All legendaries are threatening in and of themselves, but they also control the board in some way or force your opponent to react in ways they don't want to react, which goes against their game plan, and thus they have big problems with it. And the last neutral one is Ragnaros the Firelord. Not the Major Domo Executus version, but interesting in and of himself. So, you put Rag on the board, he does 8 damage to a random thing. Yes, the random effects, but the random effects tend to be in your favor regardless. I mean, smacking something for 8 damage is not insubstantial in just about any situation in the entire game. So, when you play Rag, he's an immediate threat and he needs to be dealt with. I'm sure he might get Big Game Huntered, right? But he still already did his 8 damage. So, this is why certain legendaries are just better than others, because you slap them down the board, they have an immediate effect, and then if whatever your opponent does to them, you still got value out of the play. Of course, I've seen, for whatever reason, people decide to silence Ragnaros, even though he can't attack, and that makes him into an 8/8 minion. So, I guess that's kind of an option too. Depends on what you're doing. And out of all this, you may be thinking, how exactly does a Control Warrior win the game? And that would be an interesting question to ask, because Control Warrior is also known as Wallet Warrior, because it requires exactly 2 legendaries to actually function in any noticeable way. So the first is the class-exclusive legendary, Grommash Hellscream. Grommash is a strange kind of card. So it has that charge thing, which is supposed to be the hallmark of Warrior in both Hearthstone and World of Warcraft. Is an 8 mana for 4/9, and when it takes any kind of damage, it basically turns into a 10/8. Something to that effect. And if you give it a Cruel Taskmaster, it basically becomes 12 damage. And that 12 damage goes right out of the hand. With Thaurissan, it's a little cheaper. So again, you can see why Thaurissan works. But this is your win condition, which is basically get your opponent below 12 health-ish, have the tool in your hand, throw Grommash out, smack him in the face. But Warrior, in the control sense, can't do the amount of damage required to make Grommash work, which is why the other essential card is Alexstrasza. So basically, when she's put into play, she's an 8/8, which is pretty darn good. And then her battle cry is to set a hero's remaining health to 15, which is also pretty great. In Control Warrior, you're not going to be wanting to use this on yourself. That means things have gone wrong somewhere. You want to use Alexstrasza in your hand and then slap her down when you have Grom and some kind of activator for Grom at the same time. Because this is basically how you win. You put Alexstrasza down, you put him to 15, then you throw Grommash in, and you smack him in the face. All these tools to stall are there for the purpose of throwing Grommash on the board and then smacking them in the face, which is pretty fantastic when you actually get to do it. I've found opponents tend to auto-concede when that happens because they know what happens. And yeah, that's pretty much Control Warrior in a nutshell. These two cards are pretty much the ones you need. You need Grom and you need Alexstrasza. A lot of the other legendaries are interchangeable. I mean, you technically don't need any of them. Of course, basically, you do need some kind of legendaries that have an immediate effect upon the board. Now, in terms of replacements, oh, there's a ton. Some use Ysera. Ysera's a little slow, but Ysera will get you a lot of card draw and some weird stuff, which can help in a long kind of Control Warrior match. I mean, Control Warrior isn't about stalling the game forever. It's about stalling it until you have your card combo and then blowing them up. But Ysera can be an interesting choice, too, in terms of replacements for other cards. Nefarious has been interesting in my experience. Getting 2 random spells to your hand from your opponent's class is pretty cool and, lore dependent. But I'm not sure if his effect is enough to make him worth playing in this. Now, in terms of a different kind of Control Warrior deck, he'd be more awesome. And I guess we should look at that soon. But anyway, in this particular setup, he's not going to be the greatest. Don't use Mech Engineer Thermoplug, much as I think his effect is awesome. And technically, there's probably some kind of whirlwind combo with a bunch of Lepernones and you kill your opponent. I don't know whether or not it can work. Major Domo Executus is not a good choice. I'm just going to say that right out. Sneed's Old Shredder is great. The problem I'm finding with it is that anytime I put it in a deck and I play it, it gets silenced. So you get a 5/7 for 8, which it sucks pretty bad. And, well, Sneeds can win you a game. It can be really fun. You can activate it on the turn. I find it much better in a Hunter deck with Feign Death, so I can immediately get value out of the Death Rattle. And I think that's also the same problem with Karen Bloodhoof. Is I don't have Karen, but I can see why he's not as useful. Now, Kel'Thuzad might be interesting, but again, there's not enough minions on the board for Control Warrior, so it just doesn't work. Grola's really okay. That's all I gotta say. Foe Reaper could make for an interesting 8-drop. It depends on what kind of decks you're playing against. He's out of big game Hunter range, which is a plus, but it depends on the kinds of decks you're facing against. Because the 6 and doing 6 to 2 adjacent minions is pretty swell, but sometimes he just does not live through the turn after you play him. The lack of an immediate effect is problematic. I mean, you could play him in place of Rag, but Rag automatically does 8 damage, whereas Foe Reaper is like a turn to set up, and you really have no way to protect him within that time frame, which is the problem. Chromagus, I'm not sure. I'm not sure if Control Warrior needs this, necessarily. I've not found a ton of problems with card draw unless I'm losing and made a lot of poor decisions, but I think in some sense it could work. It would just be that getting him on the board, you immediately get a draw. I mean, if you had a bunch of stuff to card draw already, he'd be really good, but I don't know if it would be the best. Rend, again, you would have to build a Dragon Control Warrior, which we'll look at in a second. But basically, to kill a legendary minion for 7 and also get an 8/4 minion is pretty good, except for the 4 health, which is problematic. But it does force them to kill him immediately, which is a plus. Black Knight might be good. Depends on if you see a lot of taunt minions. It's the kind of thing where it's like, oh, do you want Harrison, or do you want Lotheb, or do you want this kind of technical card? It really depends on what you're facing. Black Knight can be really good, but can also be kind of a 4/5 for 6, which is not so great. The Beast, don't bother. Mogor, don't bother. Those are fun cards. I've not found Hager very useful in this, so I'm just going to say Hager is not useful unless you got a kind of a big minion-heavy deck. And I think that's it for useful cards I would actually put in a Control Warrior deck. So, anyway, that's the standard Control Warrior. The new Control Warrior that seems to be going around has a lot of the same components. It takes out one armor smith, which seems weird. But then you go down, and it throws in a brawl, which is, brawl can be good in Control Warrior too. I just don't seem to have one in the other one. But the reason why it's called Dragon Control, obviously, is because it has a lot of dragons on the top end instead. So Grom's still in here, Alex Strauss is still in here, but we've got some of the BRM cards. So we got Nefarious. He's fun just to get more card draw, possibly at the end of the game. Isara also gives you more card draw, basically at the end of the game. Dr. Boom's still in here. And a Blackwing Corruptor is really what makes the difference here, which is basically you get the effect of the Shaman's Fire Elemental for 5. The minion's not quite as good. I mean, they get a 6/5, you get a 5/4. But this is 1 mana less, so it's not so bad. But the 3 damage just for holding a dragon, which you're going to be holding a dragon, because all the dragons in this deck are 9 mana. They will not get played. So you can kind of guarantee you're going to have one most of the time, but again, it can be a little inconsistent. So that's kind of the new Control Warrior you'll see around, but there's not like a huge difference between them. Alright, well, I think I've rambled on enough, about a half hour or so. So, that has been kind of a deck analysis thing. If you guys liked it, please comment. Please tell me if I just ramble on all the time. I just need some feedback on this. I had a good time talking for a long time. Maybe you didn't, but we'll see. Alright, this is Zach. See you guys next time.